Human trafficking has been recorded as the second largest criminal enterprise in the world today, second only to narcotics or illegal drugs. So good afternoon, dear students and fellow teachers. Today we're going to get to know a seemingly unfamiliar topic on anti-trafficking in persons, otherwise known as Republic Act 9208 or the Anti-Trafficking of Persons Act of 2012. Now, this topic is really not very familiar to us, as we have been used to discussions on common laws on women and children. So like the child abuse law, 9262, RA 9262, or anti-violence against women and children. And in schools, we have Anti-Bullying Act and the DepEd Child Protection Policy. So this expanded Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act of 2012 is or has been enacted in 2012. Now, what is this law and how did this law came about? So before going to the meat of the law, I would like to give you a brief history of what or how this Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act came about. So, are you aware of the United Nations or the UN? So I know that you have been watching the news, particularly regarding the war between Ukraine and Russia, and the word United Nations has been continuously flashed on TV. So you must be familiar with the UN. So the United Nations is a group of nations wherein the Philippines is a member, along with other nations like the United States and all other nations all over the world. Almost all nations are members of the United Nations. Now, the United Nations primarily aim to maintain peace and security, as well as friendly relations among nations. So the United Nations, being the mother organization of all nations, it has its own governing body. Now, this governing body creates its own laws. Now, these laws created by the governing body of the United Nations is what we now know as international laws. So an example of an international law is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I guess you're familiar with that. Okay? So in the year 2000, the United Nations crafted the Anti-Trafficking in Persons Protocol. Okay? So it was only in the year 2000, unlike other international laws which were crafted in 1990s, this law has been established only in the year 2000. Now, this was based on 5 considerations. There was slavery, which was dominant in the 1800s. There was prostitution, forced labor, human rights violations, and then the rights of the child. So these are the 5 pillars upon which this Anti-Trafficking in Persons Protocol of the United Nations was based or established. So are you familiar with slavery? So I think you're fond of watching Netflix. No? So in the Netflix, I've seen movies on slavery, Mandela and Harriet. So I think you've seen those movies. They tackle, these movies are about slavery. So these people, the Black Americans, had been fighting to be free from slavery way back in the 1800s. So because of that, the United Nations established the Protocol on Anti-Slavery, which seeks to abolish entirely slavery all over the world. Because slavery has been prevalent in the US, the Western nations, and even in Africa, but not so much in the Philippines. And then there was prostitution. So the United Nations also established the Anti-Prostitution Protocol. So it sets the standards for which other member nations has to follow in terms of establishing protocols or legislations to fight prostitution or to end prostitution. And then forced labor. The International Labor Law prohibits forced labor, no? And this also protects the rights of migrant workers wherever they may be. And then fourth, there is the International Declaration of Human Rights. This is the handbook of all human rights laws all over the world, because there are 193 as to date. There are 193 members of the United Nations out of the 200 plus countries all over the world. So this Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the handbook of all human rights laws all over the world. Lastly, there was the Convention on the Rights of Children. The Convention of the Rights of Children was established only in 1989. So of all the 5 pillars of the Anti-Trafficking of Persons Protocol, this is the youngest. This is the newest. This CRC, or the Convention on the Rights of the Child, was the first law which acknowledges that the problem on anti-trafficking on children, that this is the first legislation that acknowledged that indeed there exists trafficking of children all over or across the borders all over the world. And particularly, Article 35 of this CRC stressed that all member nations should establish their own rules and regulations to prohibit or eradicate totally the anti-trafficking of children across the borders all over the world. So this is how our Anti-Trafficking of Persons Act of 2012 came to be. Okay, did you get it? So the history of Anti-Trafficking of Persons Act 2012. So are you now ready? We will now start our discussion on Anti-Trafficking of Persons Act of 2012. Now you might ask, is this different from the Anti-Trafficking in Persons Protocol of the UN? Yes, because the Anti-Trafficking of Persons of the UN, of the United Nations, is an international law. The Anti-Trafficking of Persons Act of 2012, or RA number 9208, as amended by RA 10364, is a local legislation. This is a national law. So what is the difference? This is applicable, supposedly, a local law or a local legislation, a national legislation is applicable only within its territorial jurisdiction. So it being a law of the Philippines, it is only applicable in the Philippines. Whereas the international protocol on anti-trafficking in persons is applicable for all member nations. But this law, the Anti-Trafficking of Persons Act of 2012, is unique because this is applicable also across the borders of the Philippines. Now, this is in accordance with the mandate of the International Protocol on Anti-Trafficking of Persons in the year 2000 of the United Nations. So, for example, there is a trafficking of a child which happens in the Philippines. So she is from Baybay, and she was transported to Manila, and then eventually she was transported to the US. So there was supposedly our law is no longer applicable with outside the boundaries of the Philippines. But what makes this Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act of 2012 unique is that it is still applicable even outside the borders of the Philippines, because this is a transitory legislation. So this applies wherever the act or parts of the act is committed or occurred or transpired. So this can be filed in Baybay, this can be filed in Manila, and this can also be filed in the US. But the Philippines takes jurisdiction of anti-trafficking violations concerning its citizens. Okay? So wherever Filipino citizens may be sent, in cases of trafficking of persons, for example, they are transported to the US or Canada, they will be sent back to the Philippines. And those perpetrators will also answer crimes in relation to this act in the Philippines. Okay, because these member nations of the United Nations, they have extradition treaty. So what do you mean by extradition treaty? If you commit a crime in the Philippines and then you go to the US, you hide there to avoid criminal prosecution, the Philippine laws, the Philippine court can file a case in the US to have you extradited back to the Philippines to answer your crime here. So that is an extradition treaty. So being a member of the UN and being a signatory of the extradition treaty, they have the obligation to send back the perpetrator back to the Philippines to answer his crimes. So what is Republic Act 9208 as amended by RA 10364? The Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act of 2003 institutes policies to eliminate trafficking in persons, especially in women and children. But do not take it as it is only for women and children, because men are really complaining, why are laws always for women and children? Now, so this would also include men. But the vulnerable victims are always the women and children. So the emphasis is on women and children. Okay, but it is also applicable for men. It establishes the necessary institutional mechanisms to protect and support trafficked persons and provides penalties for violations. So we had our first law on anti-trafficking in the year 2003, and it was amended in 2012 to become RA 10364, the expanded Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act of 2012. So trafficking in persons is an illegal act and is considered a violation of human rights and inimical to human dignity and national development. There are three interrelated and independent elements that must be present for a situation to be considered within the purview of RA 9208 as amended: the acts, the means, and the purpose. So there must be, for the acts, there must be movement of person from one place to another. So the means, there must be achievement without the consent or through improper means or mechanisms. And the third purpose is for exploitation. So always for exploitation. Okay? So this involves the recruitment, obtaining, hiring, providing, offering, transportation, transfer, maintaining, harboring, or receipt of persons with or without the victim's consent or knowledge within or across the national borders. So it is imperative that there should be a transportation or transfer of the victim from one place to the other, within or across national borders. When you say within, it should be within, it might be within the Philippines, for example, from Baybay City to Manila, or from Mindanao to Luzon, or across national borders, it can be within, from the Philippines to, for example, Indonesia, or from Philippines to China. Okay? As to the means, it is committed by the use of threat, force, or other forms of coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power or position, taking advantage of vulnerability of person, or giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person. So with regards to the means are the consent of the person should be obtained through illegal means. There should be threat, intimidation, or force, except if the victim is a child. Okay? So the purpose, it is done for the purpose of exploitation or prostitution or other form of sexual exploitation, forced labor or services, slavery, involuntary servitude, or the removal or sale of organs. Okay? So there should be transportation of one person from one place to the other. The means employed should be there should be force, intimidation, or threat, or other illegal or unlawful means for the purpose of, like, slavery, sexual exploitation, forced labor, or removal of sale of organs. Those are the elements of Anti-Trafficking of Persons Act in 2012. So what is forced labor? So forced labor is the extraction of work or services from any person by means of enticement, violence, intimidation, or threat, or use of force or coercion, including deprivation of freedom, abuse of authority or moral ascendancy, death, bondage, or deception, including any work or service extracted from any person under the menace of penalty. Okay? So forced labor is necessarily compelling you to do labor, to do work, no, against your will by means of force or violence or intimidation. So hadlokon ka, no? So kinahanglan mo trabaho ka, kung di ka mo trabaho, patyunta ka. So that is forced labor. The second is death bondage. Refers to the pledging by the debtor of his or her personal service or labor, or those of a person under his or her control, as security or payment of a debt. Utangan ka, you don't have means to pay, and the money lender would just say, okay, wala man kay kabayad, pamaid na lang ka sa amo, sa katuig. No? So, remember, your debt was only like 2,000 pesos and you will be working in the house or in the family of the money lender for like a month or two or more than that. So that is not commensurate to your debt. Remember that the minimum wage now is, the minimum wage of house helpers is about 4,000 to 5,000 a month, and you only owe like 2,000, and you're required to work in the household of the lender for months. So that is debt bondage. Okay? Then another is slavery. So as I have mentioned earlier, slavery is occurred sometime in 1800s. So slavery is unique because there is slavery when one human being is owned by another human being. So unlike other elements, unlike other factors of this Anti-Trafficking Act, slavery is very unique because when you say you are a slave, you are practically owned by somebody else. You might be born to your parents who are also slaves, but eventually you will also become a slave of the owners of your parents. You can be sold, then you can be sold for a price, and then the buyer will become your new owner, and practically she owns or he owns you. Everything that you do should be in accordance with the will of your owner. That is what slavery is all about. So nowadays, very rarely could we see slavery in its pure extent, no? But this was prevalent in the year 1800s in America, in in Europe, in Africa also. As what we have been seeing in the movie is true, no? So as I've mentioned earlier, there are movies, particularly Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela fought for the freedom of slaves way back, and he even became the president, no? He was really into fighting against slavery. Then we have involuntary servitude. Involuntary servitude is a condition of enforced or compulsory service rendered by means of any scheme, plan, or pattern intended to cause a person to believe that if he or she does not enter into or continue to be in such condition, he or she or another person would suffer serious harm or other forms of abuse or physical restraint or threats or abuse or harm. So in involuntary servitude, there is this element of what we commonly known as blackmail, no? So for example, you committed a mistake and you stole something and there was a witness in the process of stealing something, and then the witness will say, hey, I saw you stealing something in the store. And then of course you are frightened, you are afraid. Hey, what would I do for you, just for you not to say something about it? Now you remember karong panahon na there are a lot of marites already. So this person must say, okay, I will not say anything about it provided you will work in my, you are a baker, I know that you are a baker, for example, you will work in my bakery for free. So that is involuntary servitude, no? So patrabahoon ka, kay gihadlok ka nga namitabo nimo or any member of your family. If you will not work in my establishment, I will do something against your father. Ang imo ra bang father, kung ano ba ni siya? So ana na siya. That is involuntary servitude. Or this normally happens to illegal aliens. So kining mga Filipinos who are in other nations with tourist visas, kini sila, they normally stay in that country to find work, no? So if they are discovered by somebody else that their stay in that particular place is illegal, they normally are victims of this so-called involuntary servitude. They work for free just for that person not to divulge the truth about your stay in that particular country. Okay, so I am really fond of watching movies, and there is this one movie that I've seen. I think the movie was starred by Tom Hanks. The setting was in the airport. So when Tom Hanks arrived in the US, he was deemed to be an illegal alien already because there was a sort of a civil war in his country. So when he arrived in the US, he was not allowed to go outside the airport because he was deemed to be an undocumented alien. So he was forced to work within the airport, no? So if he was required to do something against his will, that would be involuntary servitude. But if he offered her services just for him to have food or something to eat or a place where he could sleep, that is not involuntary servitude. So what happened to Tom Hanks in that movie is not involuntary servitude because he voluntarily worked just for him to have something to eat. But if in that movie the airport personnel required him to do something for him not to be deported back, then that would become involuntary servitude. So you might wonder, is human trafficking or trafficking in persons the same as illegal recruitment or human smuggling? So the answer is no. There are three different crimes. So in trafficking in persons, it may or may not involve coercion, fraud, deception, or abuse of vulnerability. In illegal recruitment, usually does not involve coercion but uses more of deception, promise, or fraud. Whereas in human smuggling, usually does not involve coercion. Okay, as to the entry of persons, in trafficking in persons characterized by subsequent exploitation after the illegal entry of one person from one place to another or one country to another. In illegal recruitment, it's characterized by facilitating entry of one person from one country to another through unlicensed agency. And then human smuggling is characterized by facilitating for a fee the illegal entry of person into a foreign country. So the three crimes really differed in the entry of persons. So in trafficking of persons, it's more or less forced. Now there must be intimidation, threat, or violence just to bring that person, transport that person from one place to another. In illegal recruitment, there is the absence of force or intimidation, but more of deception. In our term, it is ilad. So pangilad. So kung in trafficking of persons, gihadlok, no? Or gihulga, kinahanglan na paghulga, paghadlok, pagpugos to transport one person, the person from one place to another. In illegal recruitment, there is deception, pangilad, no? So these recruitment agencies would misrepresent themselves that they are agents of companies outside the Philippines. So for example, mayingon ko nga na ako'y contact ngadto sa UAE nga ingabot nimo ngadto, you will work as a sales lady, no? So she or he misrepresents himself na siya'y licensed to engage in recruitment, but in fact wala. So what will happen is that normally in illegal recruitment, the person cannot really travel abroad because he lacks documents. If indeed he would be able to travel abroad to go to other country, the promised employment would not be the same. So in accordance with your agreement with the illegal recruiter, he would say, okay, abot nimo ngadto sa UAE, magtindera ka ngadto sa mall. But eventually, you will become a domestic helper. Okay? Now, in human smuggling, different ang human smuggling because it is the person who wanted to go to another country who will pay, no? Who will pay the perpetrator just for him to be transported to another country so that possibly he could find work or seek greener pasture. So, you could see this in the movie katong mga Chinese nga nanakay sa barko unya itago lang sila unya ingadto sila sa US. So the transportation of these people from one place to another was obtained was on their volition. Ila nang gusto nga mongadto sila. So sila ni bayad sa smugglers, sa human smugglers para lang sila ngadto sa laing country para they were promised work, no? So ila nang bayaran. So this also happens in Mexico. So just for them makaadto sila sa US, makatabok sila sa US, mubayad sila. That is human smuggling. Okay? Now, as to another element, the purpose, no? As to the purpose. in trafficking of persons, there is a need to prove the presence of exploitation. So always, in trafficking of persons, there should always be this element of exploitation. In trafficking of persons, the purpose should always be for exploitation, like prostitution and forced labor. That element is not absent in illegal recruitment and human smuggling. No? Because there is no exploitation in illegal recruitment and human smuggling. Because in the first place, the person knows that more often than not, in illegal recruitment, it is even the person who offered money to the recruiter for just him to be recruited and for him to be able to work in other country. In trafficking of persons, there is no such thing. There is no payment of money. There was no consent obtained from the victims of human trafficking. There was purely the presence of threat, force, and intimidation for this person to be transported from one place to another. So ang purpose ng trafficking in persons is para lang yun ang kini siya nga tao nga gi-transport without his consent, para ibaligya ngadto, para mag-work ngadto without pay, or engage in prostitution or other illegal activities, or worse, kining extraction of organs, no? Kay kusog man kaini siya karon kining mga extraction of organs. That's why kidnapping is also prevalent in other countries, which happens more often to tourists, especially tourists nga walay mga kauban, no? So what we see in the movies is really true, no? Kanang kidnapon kay nya panguhaan og organs, pamatyon, tinuod na siya. That is why this Trafficking in Persons Act or this Trafficking in Persons Protocol of the UN was really strengthened, no? Kay daghan naman na siya karon all over the world. Now, as to the human rights and migration issue, trafficking in persons is considered a human rights issue, whereas illegal recruitment is considered a migration, as well as human smuggling are both migration issues. Now, there are three categories of trafficking in persons. First is acts of trafficking in persons. Second, acts that promote trafficking in persons, and qualified trafficking in persons. Okay. Trafficking in persons is to recruit, obtain, hire, provide, offer, transport, transfer, maintain, harbor, or receive a person by any means, including those done under the pretext of domestic or overseas employment, training, or apprenticeship for the purpose of prostitution, pornography, sexual exploitation, or forced labor. So there is always that element of exploitation, remember, in trafficking of persons. No? In the end, there is always that element of exploitation, illegal means. No? It is also to introduce or match for money, profit, or material, economic, or other consideration any person, or as provided under RA 6955, any Filipino women to a foreign national for marriage for the purpose of acquiring, buying, offering, selling, or trading her to engage in prostitution, pornography, sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery, involuntary servitude, or forced death bondage. So this is different from what is going on nowadays with our neighbors, our friends who are married to Americans. Huh? It's not automatically that when you marry a foreigner, when this foreigner asks you to go to other country and they're a fiancé visa, that this foreigner is already committing violation of this Anti-Trafficking Act. No? So, again, you should always remember that the end, no, the goal of trafficking in persons, in order for that person to violate this law, there should always be exploitation in the end. If you only transfer one person to another for the purpose of marrying her, like the Filipino will be sent to the US for the purpose of really marrying her to become a wife, then there is no trafficking of persons in the first place. Because trafficking in persons should always be for exploitation. Now, the Filipino wife should be engaged in pornography, sexual exploitation, or forced labor for that foreigner husband to be liable for anti-trafficking in persons. No? Now, without this act, there is no violation of this law. So do not be confused about mail order brides or marrying foreigners and trafficking of persons for exploitation. Then, to offer or contract marriage, real or simulated, for the purpose of acquiring, buying, selling, or trading them to engage in prostitution, pornography, sexual exploitation, and forced labor. Again, this is similar, no? So, if the marrying of the Filipino wife is for the purpose of exploiting her, for her to engage in forced labor, prostitution, and other sexual abuse, that is anti-trafficking of persons. Otherwise, it's not. Okay? To undertake or organize tours or travel plans consisting of tourism packages or activities for the purpose of utilizing and offering persons for prostitution, pornography, or sexual exploitation. To maintain, to hire a person to engage in prostitution or pornography. To adopt persons by any form of consideration for exploitative purposes, or to facilitate the same for purposes of prostitution, pornography, sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery, and the likes. So I think most of us here have gone to Bohol or Boracay or Palawan, right? So one time we were in Bohol, I've observed that there were foreigners with very young partners. No, the ladies were very young. So I asked, we ate somewhere else, and in that particular establishment, I asked the owner, are these people really married to these foreigners? Then they would answer in the negative. So that was how I realized that these young women are or were prostitutes. You might ask, is this trafficking in persons? No. The answer is no. If there is no transfer, if there is no transporting of this person from one place to another to engage in prostitution or the acts that are deemed to be within the purview of this law, it is not a violation of this act. Now, is this a crime? Of course, yes. No? Of course, yes. There might be, this might be child abuse, this might be rape, if the child is below 12 years old, because we now have statutory rape. But this is not trafficking in persons if there is no transport, if the girl is not being transferred from one place to another. But if this girl from Bohol is being transferred to Cebu to engage in prostitution, there is trafficking of persons. That is a violation of this act. So I think that's all for this afternoon. We will continue our discussion on the acts of trafficking in persons tomorrow. So I hope to see you again tomorrow. And if you have questions, just write it on a piece of paper and I will answer it all on the last session. Thank you.